Start tonight by just reminding people of the pandemic of 1918 and the fact that it took 50 years, more than 50 years after that pandemic for people to start thinking about its impact and consequences. Because when bad things happen, our tendency is to hope to put them behind us and sort of not have to think about them and consider them to be over. And that has relevance to our presentation tonight. It's a pleasure to be able to introduce you to Laurie Stevenson, who has a history both here in Massachusetts and in New York doing epidemiology. In fact, I realized that we have mutual acquaintances from 3 different parts of her career and 2 different parts of my career, which, you know, that 6 degrees of separation probably applies. Laurie did her undergraduate education at Sarah Lawrence and graduate work at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. After she got her MPH in public health, she got her MPH, she worked with the New York City Department of Health as well as the New York City Department of Health and Hospitals and taught at the City University of New York and Hunter College. During the early part of her career, as I said, she worked on the New Bedford PCB project with the State Laboratory and the Bureau of Environmental Health here at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. And also later on in her career worked on the Logan Airport project with the department's Bureau of Environmental Health. So she has 1 foot in Massachusetts, 1 foot in New York, both feet right now in Massachusetts. And we're fortunate for that because after moving here 2 or 3 years ago, she became interested in the museum and now has been involved in the museum. And we saw it as a tremendous opportunity because the key point about her career right now is that she worked for the Mount Sinai World Trade Center Medical Monitoring and Treatment Program as an epidemiologist, data analyst, and was at the heart of that, as well as being in New York City on the day on 9/11/2001. So Laurie is going to give her perspective on this and share with us both her experience of 9/11 as well as his experience with the long-term consequences of a disaster. Laurie.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm here tonight to speak to you about some of my experiences on 9/11 and in the aftermath of 9/11 as a member of the World Trade Center Medical Monitoring and Treatment Program at Mount Sinai in New York City. Some of these recollections will be my personal experience about the day of 9/11 and thereafter. Others will be images that are probably very familiar to all of us of that day. And some of these may be deeply unsettling. It was a deeply unsettling day. I'll then touch on the conditions downtown post-collapse, during rescue and recovery and cleanup operations, the beginnings of the World Trade Center Health Program, which I joined in 2004, and then some of the earlier findings of the mental and physical health status of rescue, recovery, and cleanup workers up through the 10th anniversary. I will warn you that revisiting this can be very emotional for some, myself included. So if I tear up a bit, I ask that you please bear with me. I've been through this talk a few times, so I think I'm going to be just fine, but it is kind of heavy stuff. Yep, hang on. I've got to figure out how come this, I need to change the, I'm sorry.
It's okay, you just can screen share.
Hang on. Sorry about this, guys. I need a teenager.
No worries.
PowerPoint right there. Okay, good. Nope, it's not working. Hang on.
Already stop sharing. Share.
Sorry.
You're okay. Technology is fun.
Huh.
All right, I can see it.
Hang on.
Sometimes you have to do it on the screen.
Yeah. Hang on.
We can see it.
There you go. Okay.
Perfect.
Voila, and apologies. Obviously, I am a techno neophyte or a Luddite or whatever we're going to call us. So this is the way I like to remember the World Trade Center. I think we all remember where we were when the planes hit. I remember the day vividly. In New York, it was a crystal clear, warm, late summer day. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. The kind of day that makes you forget that fall is just around the corner. My husband and I had just attended a kindergarten teacher conference for our oldest child. The teacher came in very early, so we wouldn't be too late to work. I was dropping him at the train station in our small Westchester County community when the news came of a plane hitting the World Trade Center. I said to him, "Oh, some poor guy in a Cessna must have had a heart attack." His response to me was, "It was terrorism." After chiding him for being so silly, I went on my way, not wanting to be too late to my office in Upper Manhattan. You can see the towers from the Bruckner Expressway on the approach to the Triborough Bridge. I saw smoke billowing out and then another huge blast, which I come to find out was probably the second plane hitting the World Trade Center. Since the second plane hit only about 15 minutes after the first, this probably attests to the fact that I was driving way too fast. I was in shock. I was confused by what I was witnessing. Sirens and fire trucks were screaming down the highway. I remember vividly people not getting out of the way and me being frustrated that people weren't moving. I had little idea what was going on, so I did what any self-respecting child would do, and I called my dad. And he was in Acton. I asked him to turn on CNN and tell me what was happening. All he said was, "You need to turn around." If you've been on the Bruckner on the approach to the bridge, you know that turning around really isn't an option. So I made it into Manhattan. At the towers, many people estimate as much as 200 jumped or fell to their deaths. Much of the unfolding disaster was watched by the young eyes of students at several elementary schools on nearby streets, many of whom had parents who worked in the Trade Center. Those elementary schools on Greenwich Street are particularly close to the World Trade Center, as well as students from the Stevenson High School. A friend of mine at the Department of Public Health had a daughter who was about the same age as my daughter. They lived on Greenwich Street and they were very close to the World Trade Center and they could not stay in their apartment. After all of this, they came up and camped with us for a few days. Ashley, the daughter, and Lucy, my daughter, were sitting at the table for dinner. A thunderstorm rolled in across the park behind our house. Ashley looked out the window and she screamed in her 5-year-old voice, "The blast, the blast!" And she tucked herself under the table and shivered and cried. I was at a loss with how to comfort this child. We all watched as the towers fell. The South Tower was the first to collapse at 9:59, with Tower 1 following at 10:28. The resulting enormous cloud of debris covered lower Manhattan and areas beyond with a thick layer of dust. A colleague of mine desperately tried to reach her husband, who worked at the World Financial Center, which is directly across from the World Trade Center. When she finally got through to him, and this is another aspect of the dust cloud, it was absolutely terrifying. She begged him to leave the office, but he refused to leave until all of his people were safely out. Thankfully, he did make it home, as that building, World Financial Center 3, which is where American Express was located, was so heavily damaged by the collapse of the buildings. Many others were not so lucky. In our small village of Larchmont, 5 persons were killed, including the father of a classmate of my daughter and the pregnant wife of the school custodian, both of whom worked at Cantor Fitzgerald on the upper floors of Tower 1. Cantor suffered the loss of 658 souls that day. The towers took out all the other buildings on the World Trade Center Plaza. World Trade Center 3, 4, and 6 were completely destroyed. World Trade Center 5 partially collapsed, and World Trade Center 7, mayor's emergency bunker was located there, was damaged and on fire, and finally collapsed later that afternoon at about 5:30. The mayor had been warned by his deputy mayor for emergency operations, Jerry Hauer, not to place his Center for Emergency Operations there, but rather in a less visible location in Brooklyn, as the WTC was a known terrorist target. It had already been bombed in 1993, if you may recall. Giuliani denied that he was responsible for the location in many public forums and blamed this on Jerry Hauer. However, when confronted with a memo written by Deputy Mayor Hauer by Chris Wallace on TV, he backpedaled, but only a bit. If I recall correctly, my boss at the time, Dr. Van Dunn, who was also my former boss at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, where he was a deputy commissioner, was there and evacuated, I think through the basement, and I believe he was caught in the debris of the collapse. Around the city, hospitals were mobilized and expected hundreds of injured persons to show up. A friend at Bellevue, a pulmonologist, remembers being in the ER and waiting some more. And then the dreadful realization that no one was coming. In the subsequent days, New York City and the rest of the United States, and indeed the world, were in shock, mourning this loss and the attack on our country. All over the city, particularly around hospitals, hundreds of posters of lost loved ones were posted. Around that time, Bellevue was undergoing reconstruction of its main entrance. I attended a meeting there and walked through what I called the gauntlet. I would dare anybody to try and walk through this scene without tearing up. Rescue and recovery operations had already begun as the towers collapsed. Many persons were caught in the resulting debris cloud. Here you can see the FDNY chaplain, Michael Judge. He was casualty number 1, designated as casualty number 1 when the second tower collapsed and debris from the second tower, he was in the first tower, hit him and killed him. The next piece of this slide, you can see a fireman with his face completely covered in dust from the collapse. This is important going on. Due to the dry day, this dust was continually resuspended every time the site was bothered. This is the night of September 11th, and then the day after, this is September 12th. Think about it. 6 million square feet of masonry, 5 million square feet of painted surfaces, 7 million square feet of flooring, 600,000 square feet of window glass, 200 elevators, and everything inside came down as dust when the towers collapsed. This first panel is at the Chase Plaza, which is about 3 blocks from the World Trade Center. The second is a private home nearby the site where the windows got completely blown out by the collapse of the towers. Most people have studied dust composition and air quality at ground zero and throughout the impact area. Many people, pardon me. In an early review of the composition of WTC dust and early health effects, Phil Landrigan, Polioy, and others gave an excellent review of what rescue, recovery, and cleanup workers faced. The combustion of more than 90,000 liters of jet fuel at temperatures above 1,000 degrees centigrade released a dense and intensely toxic atmospheric plume containing soot, metals, volatile organic compounds, and hydrochloric acid. The collapse of the towers pulverized cement, glass, and building contents and generated thousands of tons of particulate matter, composed of cement dust, glass fibers, asbestos, lead, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, polychlorinated biphenyls, organochlorine pesticides, polychlorinated furans, and dioxins. These materials dispersed over lower Manhattan, Brooklyn, and for miles beyond. They entered nearby offices, schools, and residential buildings. Much remained at the site to form what we called Ground Zero, a 6-story pile of smoking rubble that burned intermittently for more than 3 months. Oh, sorry. Another aspect of the WTC dust was that it was incredibly alkaline, as shown by the slide from the United States Geologic Survey. You can see that the WTC indoor dusts were quite alkaline. The outdoor dusts were somewhat modified by rain events on the 14th and 16th that helped neutralize the pH of these dusts. However, the fires kept burning until December 19th, and dust kept on getting resuspended by activity at the site. And here you can see workers on the site. And I would like you to note that, particularly in the first panel, and it's kind of hard to see, so I apologize, the lack of protective equipment on many of these workers. The second slide shows more people with respiratory protection, but this was not the norm, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Overall, the proportion of respirable particulate, that's, particulate matter below 2.5 microns, was low. In most samples, it was between about 0.88 to 1.88%, although there was a huge amount of particulate. And in hindsight, we know now that maybe we should have been a little more worried about the larger particles as well, those that can be lodged in upper airways and be swallowed. We know a lot about the toxicity and particle makeup of this dust. What no one ever seems to mention is the very distinctive smell of the smoke and fumes from the site. If you had ever smelled it, it's a smell you cannot forget. A smell that I can only describe as the smell of death and destruction. And I know that's a little dramatic, but it is absolutely true. And it could travel. It traveled very far. My former home was very close to Long Island Sound. And in early October, I was having dinner with friends who lived up the street. I ran back to my house to pick up something we had forgotten, and the smell, it was there on my street, 27 miles away from the World Trade Center, seemingly coming up via the tidal creek behind my house. Early on, there was very little availability of appropriate personal protective equipment, and while more was available within days due to actions from health and safety advocates and others, because of the resuspension of dusts due to movement and digging and the extreme dustiness of the indoor environments that people were cleaning, filters were clogged very quickly. Working with a respirator can be physically tiring and hot. Many persons were working incredibly long shifts, particularly at the outset, in hopes of finding survivors. So between the long shifts, filters that were inadequate, and discomfort, respirator use was very inconsistent in much of this cohort. Cleanup consisted not just of removing debris and site cleanup, but also of finding human remains. By March 2002, and this photo was probably taken after March, but it will give you an idea about what the site did look like at that point. The World Trade Center site looked like a regular run-of-the-mill construction site. But what many do not know is that the workers on the site, and these are not your traditional first responders, these are construction workers, technical workers, etc., removed more than 3,000 body parts in March alone. At the outset, there was no comprehensive roster of workers, responders, or volunteers on the site. Further, no guidance on cleanup of interiors of damaged buildings, for example, was provided by city officials, and this was left solely to building owners. Early on, working at the site was sort of like an oversized game of pickup sticks, and great care had to be taken when moving debris so as not to cause more harm. Many authors note that workers started noticing symptoms involving the aerodigestive tract quite early on. Persistent cough, termed World Trade Center cough, was a hallmark symptom. Like Boston, New York has an impressive health infrastructure. However, this infrastructure was not sufficient to provide for a unified approach for screening and treatment. Local labor unions who had a long relationship with occupational health clinics in New York State, chiefly the Selikoff Center at Mount Sinai, made elected officials aware of their concerns. And in 2002, CDC allotted much of the funding for the creation of the worker and volunteer medical screening program. Other funds were provided by philanthropic groups. The goals of this program were as follows: to rapidly build a regional and national consortium of occupational medicine clinics to conduct geographically convenient standardized medical evaluations, to identify WTC responders, notify them about the program, and encourage participation. And this was done through a series of, community organizations, unions, and everything in between. To provide clinical examinations for eligible individuals to identify WTC-related physical and/or mental health conditions. To coordinate referral for follow-up clinical care for affected individuals. To educate workers and volunteers about exposures and the associated risks to their health. Pardon me, I'm not going to go quite there yet. This isn't the time or place to go into the long history of establishing continuing funding for this program. However, without the assistance of Carolyn Maloney and Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, in addition to the advocacy and testimony of organized labor and several concerned occupational health physicians, among others, and workers and volunteers at the site, and finally the advocacy of Jon Stewart. Yes, that Jon Stewart. This program may not have continued. And Jon Stewart actually came to the Zadroga Act's rescue, I think, on 3 separate occasions. Unfortunately, this gentleman, Detective Alvarez, died shortly thereafter, after having undergone, I think, 69 chemotherapy events. For the remainder of my time, I would like to review a couple of observational studies of World Trade Center responders that I've been involved in. A full reckoning of the 9/11 literature would require a weeks-long conference, so I'm going to limit myself to 2 studies. Eligibility for entry into the responder cohort was based on the duration at a number of WTC-related sites and time on the site. You had to either work or volunteer in Lower Manhattan, Staten Island landfill, which was reopened to take the debris from the site. We had just closed the landfill, reopened it for this purpose only. The barge loading piers, which were what brought the garbage over to Staten Island, for at least 4 hours from 9/11 to 9/14. You had to work worked 24 hours during September of 2001, worked 80 or more hours between September and December 2001, were members of the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, because those people handled all the human remains, and that was a very taxing, mentally taxing in particular, and possible exposure from the different body parts. And then Port Authority workers who were engaged in tunnel cleaning from 9/11 to July 1st, 2002, when the tunnels became completely clean. The first piece is a piece from the MMWR from 2004, describing physical health status of World Trade Center workers from a subset of more than 11,000 rescue and recovery workers seen from July 2002 up through July 2004. The subset was comprised of 1,138 non-FDNY rescue and recovery workers seen between July and December 2002. The FDNI has a parallel but separate program. So, they have their own program. And also the New York City Department of Health runs a program for residents and people that were not responders but were downtown. As an aside, early funding did not provide for data entry and comprehensive analysis. And this is why this study is limited to such a small subset of participants. Okay, this is a super busy slide, and I'm going to throw it up there, but then I'm going to pull it away so that you don't have to get too worried about it. Our cohort for this study was predominantly male, non-Hispanic, white, with a median age of 41 years. The majority of the population were union members, over 80%, with technical and utility workers, police officers and construction workers making up approximately 2/3 of the population studied. Almost half of these individuals reported working on September 11th, with 84% reporting working between September 11th and 14th, when exposure was likely the highest. Only 1/5 reported using a full or half face respirator at any time during that period. Approximately 28% reported being directly in the dust cloud from collapse, which is about half of those who reported being in lower Manhattan on 9/11. While other symptoms were evaluated, here I'm going to focus on respiratory symptoms and spirometry. Among responders who reported a pre-existing upper or lower respiratory symptoms, 1/3 to 1/2 reported a worsening of their symptoms while working on the site. 58% of responders reported at least one new onset or incident lower respiratory symptom. Most frequently mentioned was new onset dry cough and shortness of breath. 40% of those with new onset lower respiratory symptoms reported that their symptoms persisted to the month prior to their screening examination. So they developed symptoms, those symptoms stayed with them. 70% reported at least one new onset respiratory symptom, and 50% reported their symptoms persisted to the month prior to the screening examination. Participants underwent spirometry before and after an inhaled bronchodilator. A substantial portion of participants had respiratory abnormalities on spirometry. Never and current smokers had similar findings, with approximately 1/3 having abnormal spirometry findings, primarily because of results suggesting restriction, which is the second to last row down in the slide. A total of 27% of those with airway obstruction had a significant bronchodilator response consistent with asthma. Now, compare with the general population sample of employed adult white males using the National Health and Nutrition Examination surveys. The 599 participants who had never smoked had a higher prevalence of abnormalities on spirometry, 31% in this population versus 13% in NHANES. And this was attributable to a higher prevalence of restriction in the WTC cohort, 21% in this population versus 4% in the NHANES general population. This is made even more interesting or alarming, if you will, in that this is a population of persons who typically participate in physical activity. I mean, they are in physical labor, they are construction workers, you know, they are fairly healthy individuals. And so they may be more fit than the general employed population, i.e. they probably have bigger force vital capacities than the run-of-the-mill working population of the United States. The second study I'll discuss is a paper written for the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. While this paper evaluates self-reported diseases rather than symptoms, you'll see that there is something of a similarity in findings. This paper reviews the annual and cumulative incidence of asthma, sinusitis, gastroesophageal reflux disease, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression and panic disorder, as well as spirometric abnormalities among 27,449 responders seen between July 16th, 2002 and September 11th, 2010. Similar to the prior study, the participants were primarily male, white, non-Hispanic, with a median age of 38. Almost 2/3 were never smokers, while approximately 1/4 were former smokers. 83% were union members. As enrollment had been ongoing, I wanted to review the dates of enrollment for this cohort. As you can see, more than 11,000 enrolled before 2004, another 9,500 enrolled between 2005 and 2007, and 6,643 enrolled after 2008. You know, this rolling enrollment sort of, you know, makes it a little more difficult to sort of figure out what's really going on. But we use some statistical methods, that I'm not going to get into. Don't worry, I won't go into a statistics thing, I promise. I'm going to review the cumulative incidence overall and then stratified by exposure group. This isn't that annual incidence is not of interest, it is. However, we didn't stratify annual incidence by exposure group, and I do think that that exposure stratification makes for very interesting discussion. Overall, cumulative incidence of asthma was 10.5% at baseline, 13.7% at year 1, 21.1% at year 5, and 27.6% at year 9. Sinusitis has a similar trajectory, 10.7% at baseline, 18% at year 1, 31.2% at year 5, and 42.3% at year 9. GERD follows, of course, a similar trajectory, 5.8% at baseline, 10.7% at year 1, 25.4% at year 5, and a whopping 39.3% at year 9. Findings for mental health outcomes were evaluated using standardized instruments and algorithms, for example, the PHQ and the PTSD questionnaire. The findings were stratified by police officers versus all others based on findings that police may be more resistant to the mental health outcomes studied. And they may, you may self-select into that occupation because you have that resistance and resilience. So in both groups, PTSD had the highest incidence. For non-NYPD, hang on, I'm just gonna get through all of these and then we can go back to them. For non-NYPD, year 1 found a 12.8% incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder. That's the second line down in the blue circle. Well, in NYPD, it was only 2.5% at year 9. Cumulative incidence in non-NYPD cohort members was 31.9% versus 9.3% among NYPD members. Again, the trajectory is a rise. Depression and panic disorder between groups showed similar distinctions, with 10.8% of non-NYPD members screening positive for depression and 1.7% of NYPD screening positive on year 1. In year 9, the cumulative incidence, of depression was 27.5% in non-NYPD responders versus 7% in NYPD members. 5% and 2.3% of non-NYPD and NYPD respectively screened positive for panic disorder. And by year 9, the cumulative incidence of panic disorder was 21.2% in non-NYPD responders versus 8.4% for NYPD members. Abnormal spirometry was defined, hang on, I'm gonna go forward and then backwards. As obstruction was a forced expiratory volume in 1 second, divided by the ratio between that and VFC, below the lower limits of normal. Low FVC was FVC below the lower limits of normal as defined in NHANES, but an FEV1 FVC ratio above the lower limits of normal. Mixed airway disease was defined as obstruction plus a forced vital capacity less than the lower limits of normal. This was found in 23.7%. Abnormal spirometry on year 1 was found in 23.7% of members, increasing to 29% in year 5 and 41.8% in year 9. The cohort was broken into 4 different exposure categories. Very high was 90 plus days working exposed to the dust cloud from collapse and working at least some time on the pile. That dust cloud from the collapse is really a key exposure for this group. The high exposure group was exposed to the dust cloud from collapse, but worked less than 90 days or did not work on the pile at all. The medium exposure group, where they were not exposed to the dust cloud from collapse, but they worked 40 to 90 days or did not work on the pile. And the low exposure group was worked less than 40 days, were not exposed to dust cloud from collapse, and did not work on the pile. As you can see, 14% of people were in the low exposure, 65%, so the bulk of people were in the medium, 18% were in the high, and only 3% were in the very high category. Cumulative incidence of asthma was similar in the low and medium groups throughout, and in the high and very high group until about year 6, where the very high group appears to have a somewhat higher cumulative incidence. These were done using Kaplan-Meier curves, so that, because we had staggered enrollment and everything, that took into account all of that information. We see a similar cumulative incidence across sinusitis and GERD, with those in the highest exposure categories having the highest cumulative incidence. Mental health outcomes, again, were broken out by NYPD responders versus non-NYPD responders. And as you can see, the NYPD responders, even over time, appear a lot more resistant, obviously, to some of these mental health outcomes than the non-NYPD responders. And those people in the very, very high exposure group are just very, very different from the medium and high and the low exposure groups. This just shows the same trends for depression and, again, for panic disorder. And all of these, again, were based on, accepted algorithms with very valid instruments. Cumulative incidence of abnormal spirometry was not surprisingly, given what we now know about these exposures, associated with higher exposure levels. Now, the one thing that is sort of unique about this population is that these physical health abnormalities tend to cluster together. So if you have asthma, GERD, you often have this triad of outcomes. So you have GERD, asthma, and sinusitis, each one of those irritating the other one. So they create this sort of real cycle of illness. And so we used Venn diagrams just to illustrate some of this. So this shows the overlap between the 3 mental health outcomes as well as the 3 physical health outcomes. Numerous responders, about 9% in physical and about 6% in the mental health categories, reported or screened in for all 3 diagnoses evaluated. Many others had at least 2. In addition, though this isn't shown, we found extensive comorbidity across mental and physical health conditions, with almost half with asthma, 38% with sinusitis, and 43% with GERD screened in for at least 1 mental health disorder. Okay, I know I said I wasn't going to talk about annual incidence. However, I would like to note one thing, that the annual incidence of spirometric abnormalities was more or less similar across the first 6 or so years of follow-up. It appears to jump up in years 7, 8, and 9, suggesting that these individuals either had subclinical loss and only crossed the threshold to define loss in later years. And, there's also an age-related component, but the amount of loss that we are seeing in this population is obviously much larger than what you would expect to see in age-related loss. And again, this sort of speaks to the fact that these guys probably had FVCs that were higher to begin with. And so it took them a while to get down to a point where you would actually notice a clinical loss. Okay, here's some issues to consider. The staggered enrollment means not all persons contributed data for all time periods. And, the statistical methods that we employed for this analysis, I'm sorry, my mouth is getting very dry. should compensate for this. There is no control or comparison group, and frankly, it would be almost impossible to find one. And again, if we had a control or comparison group, we might be observing the healthy worker effect, where we know that we have a population of workers that is, healthy and able to work versus other people. With self-reporting, we cannot exclude the possibility of recall bias or self-selection of workers at an increased risk. However, these findings are similar to those of the FDNY cohort, which has mandatory inclusion, i.e., if you're a fire department member, you have to participate, suggesting that workers with medical problems have not enrolled disproportionately. We also did not take personal protective equipment or other personal hygiene issues into account. The information that we got, we felt was not as reliable, and it was missing for a lot of people. So, what does this all mean? Our findings show a substantial burden of persistent physical and mental health disorders in rescue and recovery workers at the World Trade Center who labored for weeks and months many years ago. Many of these individuals suffer from multiple health problems. These findings emphasize the need for continued monitoring and treatment of these workers and underscore the importance of providing adequate health monitoring and treatment for these individuals. Planning for future disasters should anticipate the probability of persistent physical and mental illness in disaster responders. In closing, I'd like to gratefully acknowledge my supervisors, mentors, and colleagues at the World Trade Center Treatment and Monitoring Program. In particular, the developers of the World Trade Center program, Dr. Phil Landrigan, Dr. Jackie Moline, Dr. Robert Herbert, and the late Dr. Stephen Levin. There are numerous others as well, both within the Mount Sinai community and at the participating World Trade Center health clinics. I would like to thank them as well. I would also like to humbly acknowledge the thousands of rescuing, recovery, and cleanup workers who worked on the pile and the associated WTC sites for their work and their participation in this program, so that we may understand more fully the true scope of the health effects associated with their exposures. They are my heroes. Thank you.